Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the afternoon sessions of the forum. And now we will proceed to panel discussion 2, titled Economic Security and Economic Coercion, Building Economic Resilience, De-risking, and the Role of Taiwan Semiconductors in Stabilizing Global Supply Chains. There are 5 panelists with us in this session, respectively from Latvia, Canada, the USA, the Philippines, and Taiwan. Now, please welcome our moderator, Dr. Yan Huixing, Chairperson of Taiwan Council for U.S. Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of China, Taiwan. Now, I turn the floor over to Chairman Yan. Welcome.
Thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Huixing Yan. So it's a great pleasure that I can serve as the moderator of the panel. I'm also new to this government. Before I joined this government with this new administration in May. Before this, I was a trade scholar working closely with the government, and probably that's the reason I got invitation by the government to join and to that make contribution for what I have learned, what I have researched that is to see any way to realize as real actions in the policies. So I think anyway, it's a great pleasure that can be here to join our 5 distinguished speakers here today. And I think in this session, we are going to talk about some critical issues of the supply chain and international cooperation that have significance to the world. And we have witnessed the phenomena of the deglobalization and the impact of supply chain because of the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the geopolitical tensions, and also intervention from the non-market autocracy. Against this background, what used to be considered as substantial to economic development and security is now sometimes considered as risk, a source of risk. So that sometimes this kind of risk we consider nowadays that we need to, should be limited or we need to deal with it. So I think also security concerns are no longer exclusively expressed in relations to conflict, but also encompass that much wider notion of economic security, and I think some of our speakers will mention that. Today we have 5 distinguished speakers to share their views on the direct of developments of economic security and impact of the global supply chain. Before I invite them to deliver their remark, let me briefly introduce each of our speakers first. The first speaker is President from the Northern Europe Policy Center of Latvia. And I think he was also a Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defense of Latvia. Let's welcome. And our second speaker, Roland Paris, is Dr. Roland Paris. He is Director of Graduate School of Public and International Affairs from the University of Ottawa in Canada. And he was also a fellow in Halifax International Security Forum and was also associate fellow in Chatham House in UK. Let's welcome. And our third speaker, that is Mr. Han Ka-yu. He is now senior fellow from Peterson Institute for International Economics. And he was also the 8th Trade Minister of Korea from Republic of Korea, and was also secretary to the President of the Republic of Korea. Let's welcome. And also, next will be Dr. Franz Jessen. He was former EU ambassador to the Philippines, and he was also an EU ambassador to Vietnam. And I think he also have very wide experience that he also experienced that in responsible for China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and Mongolia. And let's welcome Dr. Franz Jessen. And then our colleague from Taiwan, Academics Sinica, Dr. Jianming Wu. Dr. Jianming Wu is a distinguished research fellow from the Institute of Sociology of the Academics Sinica. And he was also has great experience in a wide range of research area, including a lot of geopolitical issues and democratic and development policies. Let's welcome Dr. Wu. So I think I will give the floor to the first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Well, first of all, I would like to thank all the organizers of this forum for this wonderful reception and invitation to Taiwan. So it's really my pleasure to be among you and to share some of my views with you here. And you know, we have a saying in our part of the continent that smart people learn from the mistakes of others, so they don't need to commit those mistakes themselves. And this is why I probably would like to follow up to just recently heard keynote speech from the Slovak Prime Minister. And I would like also to bridge our experience from political part to the economic part, since this panel is also about the economic coercion and economic influence. And regarding this, I would be, of course, later on happy to hear any questions if there are such. But my experience will be, first of all, based on Latvian policies, Baltic policies, Northern Europe policies, on, of course, through the prism of ongoing war with Russia invading Ukraine. Because I also believe that the outcome of this war will very much determine the future global power situation and very much also the situation in Pacific, because people and global powers are watching our reaction. How do we do, what do we do, and what we don't do with our assistance to Ukraine. Now, once we speak about politics or economics, I must say that both things are very much intertwined together. If, for instance, I'm looking to the sociology of my own society in Latvia, then people notice and tell that they have two major priorities. One priority is security. Another priority is, of course, economic well-being. It's also important to note that if country is economically weak, it's extremely difficult to have a good economic power, also good military and political power, because economy very much determines what this country can afford. And I probably would have to start with a certain description of mistakes what we in Europe did in the past, or at least some countries did. And I think one of the concepts which you probably heard from 1990s was that, look, we live in the democratic Western world, and if we engage with authoritarian countries, we have a mutual trade, if we have a mutual interdependence, then gradually these authoritarian or totalitarian countries will become also more democratic and more like us. That was the one perception. Another perception was given by very well-known thinker Francis Fukuyama, who was also telling that there is an end of history, which basically meant that he assumed that liberal democracy has won, and now we would have eternal peace and life will be beautiful. I think, and actually Francis Fukuyama in his latest books also agreed that that was a mistake, that both these perceptions were wrong. Because, for instance, Prime Minister Heger just mentioned about this oil and gas issue, where Europe was, and many countries are still using Russian oil and gas, that this dependency was assumed by some of the Western leaders will lead to further and gradual Russian integration in liberal democratic world. In fact, the result was totally different. The result was that many of Western values became slowly corrupt. The West became much more dependent on Russian gas than Russia became dependent on the Western values or integrated these Western values. And if you are looking to the Baltic experience, then I remember that still in 2014, 2015, 2016, we were telling to our Western European partners that, look, the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, two pipelines which were going from Russia and feeding Western Europe with energy, is actually extremely political choice. And they were telling, no, 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 it's just about economics. It's nothing to do with politics. But just for you to know, Latvia is a neighboring country of Russia, and we always paid a larger price for oil than, for instance, Germany. How does it come? It comes very easy, because the Russian gas and the Russian oil has a political price and not an economic or market price. And this is the reason why we were paying more, because we were assumed by Russians to be a country which has to be in the influence area of Russia. So they were trying to influence us through energy, through any other activities, through political activities, through something else. So if you just start to trade with an authoritarian or totalitarian country which has ambitions in your territory, like, for instance, my country, afterwards there will come a political price for that. This is why I'm happy to announce, for instance, that today, when still many countries are either silent or buying gas and oil from Russia, despite of this war, Baltic states, Latvia, for instance, we are not using any drop anymore from Russian gas and Russian oil. So we were trying to cut those dependencies, economic dependencies, to be politically independent. So sometimes when we had also economic crisis in earlier times, 2008, for instance, or later, we used this crisis simply to diversify our economic cooperation and to be more dependent on our friends and like-minded countries and those countries which are not like-minded. So at this moment, our economic interaction with Russia is very small, and we feel much better with this, even if in the short term we have to pay a kind of a maybe also economic price for this. Now, another thing about economic sanctions. We know that at this moment there are a number of economic sanctions introduced against Russia, which is a correct thing because the aggressor has to be punished by international community. But unfortunately, the economic sanctions never work alone, and economic sanctions do not work very well against authoritarian countries because their resilience, their public resilience, is much higher than resilience of free and democratic states. Just like, for instance, possibilities to sacrifice the human lives, because what we see now in the front line between Russia and Ukraine, that Russians simply don't care about people's lives. They can bring 10,000 people, they can bring 100,000 people. If they die, nobody cares about this. And actually, we have been giving also before the war a very wrong signals about our attitudes if such invasion would happen. So actually, I would say that we in the West, in some sense, have been contributing to this invasion. And I will give you one short example. Just a few days before the Russian large invasion in Ukraine in February 2022, there have been a staged conference of Russian Security Council, and you could actually observe it on YouTube because they were publicizing this. And then Russian former Prime Minister Medvedev told very interesting sentences. He told, look, okay, if we invade Ukraine, what the West will do? They probably will impose some sanctions against us for a while, but then afterwards, since we are interdependent and they need money, and they run behind money, they will simply either avoid these sanctions or return to the life as usual. That was the Russian assumption. This is why they thought that they can take Ukrainian capital Kiev in 3 days, that the Western response will be fragmented, the Western response will be not strong enough. In this case, I think that the Russian authorities and Russian leadership made a mistake. They made a mistake which costs hundreds of thousands of lives to Russians, which cost to all of us hundreds of billions because this war is ongoing already the 3rd year. And we all could avoid this war because the best deterrence would be if we would be much more clear about our possibilities to defend not only values, but also the power structures and the existing order. Because Russia is one of the countries which is not satisfied, obviously, with the existing world order because they want to return to empire, what they had before. Because there are 2 ways how you can look for greatness. One way to be a great country is to develop your economy, to develop your values, make your citizens happy, make your people free. Another way how some people, like for instance leaders in Russia, seek the greatness is to be made afraid from them. So if you are afraid of me, then you respect me. And if you respect me, that means I'm a great person, even if I'm poor and even if I have nothing else to offer to my citizens, but at least you are afraid of myself. So this is currently also the Russian way. What is one more mistake, maybe what we did as a common West to avoid this war, and we still, some of maybe our allies also are committing this mistake. And I'm telling about these mistakes. Why? Because, you know, we in Northern Europe, we are culturally accommodated to the idea that if there is any problem, then we are not asking what our colleagues or friends did wrong, but what did we do wrong? What is wrong with us here inside? That sometimes is not a kind of extremely healthy approach, but this is how Northern Europeans frequently think. But in this case, I would like to bring up one more thing which was used also in previous keynote speech. This is a question about escalation. Escalation is understood differently in Russia and differently in the Western world. Because if we as a Westerners, if we are coming to, let's say, Far East, if we are coming to Japan, China, Taiwan, no matter Korea, then we know that in this part of the world there are different traditions, that there are different customs. And we also, in our diplomatic or business talks, we try to accommodate to these traditions. At least this would be a smart way to accommodate and to understand this. But when the Westerners from Berlin, Paris, London, Rome, or Washington, when they're going to Moscow, they assume that they are meeting the fellow Western politicians. And here they make a mistake. They are not a part, in a clear sense, of the Western culture. They think in a different way. So that means they must be approached also in a different way. And that brings to the next mistake, which is concerning the so-called fear of escalation. Because Russians are obviously, and leadership is, we should not underestimate our opponents. They're smart people. And when they see the angst, the fear in the eyes of, let's say, their discussion partners, they will use this. And in this case, Russia was very frequently using the argument of nuclear power. So you know, if you are helping Ukraine, remember, we are nuclear power. We also could bomb somebody and do something. And that definitely has a reflection on Western societies. These are democratic societies. People are asking their leaders, okay, maybe we could start negotiations. We could be diplomatic. And you know from your own experience and history, whenever you start some negotiations and in a not favorable position, then you're going to lose. So what would be in our advice, the Baltic advice, the Latvian advice also to our partners in the West and somewhere else? So if somebody is bullying you and coming to you, you always should show them the two ways. There is a good way and we can really talk. But we will not be scared by you. So if you have a nuclear bombs, then, dear Russians, we do have them as well. Do you really want this war? Do you want to escalate this? And I think this was a mistake where we did not provide, as the international and Western community, enough of military assistance immediately. We did not provide fully. And we still are putting restrictions on Ukrainian military forces, for instance, to legitimately target places in Russia from which they are bombing daily Ukrainian kindergartens, schools, cities, without any kind of discrimination. And you could see from the last 10 days when Ukrainians challenged this wrong assumption of escalation by actually crossing the border and invading Russia. So what happened? Russians did not announce even a war against Ukraine. It is still, in a brackets, a special operation. They didn't do anything more. They accepted that because that was a pure show of the force from Ukrainian side, because Ukrainians, just like us, they understand the mentality of their opponent much more in details. And I think this is extremely important. Whenever we are dealing with opponents, we must understand how do they think, either in economic or political terms. Now, one more thing what maybe for your region is important. You know, we in Europe, we are of course a very integrated part of the world. We have European Union and we have NATO. But one of the things what we learned from Russian invasion in Ukraine is that we need to increase our regional cooperation, because this is where we can get the first support and the first answer in the dire situation. In our case, these are fellow countries near us. Other Baltic states are part of Latvia, like Estonia, Lithuania. These are new NATO members, Finland and Sweden. This is Poland, because they understand the risks and the challenges with their own skin. It is also of existential nature for them, just like it is for us. For countries which are further, they always have to be convinced and told how the situation really are. For our neighboring countries, we don't need to explain. And I believe that human nature is similar also in the Pacific, because any crisis in Pacific, first of all, will be touched upon by other Pacific nations. Here nearby, I would mention probably Japan, South Korea, Philippines, and so on. So I believe that regional integration and regional cooperation is extremely important if you want to preserve status quo, if you want to preserve peace and stability, and not allow to be challenged. And in our case, I think regional security is playing also a very, very important role. Of course, in the Latvian case, our cooperation with the United States is of crucial nature. And we are the country which have been always supporting American presence in Europe and European continent, because that makes Europe stronger. And Europeans actually were very much pursuing in the last decades this kind of demilitarization policy, which at this moment is paying back very dearly, because most of countries are missing resources, missing economy, and etc. So I don't want to take more floor because I understand the time will be running out. But just for conclusion, I would like to say that if we want to deter the possible aggression, we always have to mix economic matters and economic tools with political tools, and political tools also with hardware tools, because you must be capable also to tell that you are willing, which is resilience, willing to defend and to stand for your values, for your societies, for your countries. And this is what we have been pursuing at home. Another thing about economic sanctions and economic pressure on any country, we must remember that it is not a silver or golden bullet, as we would say, because if people are determined by different reasons to stand for their policies, no matter how hard you will press economically, they will not subdue. I mean, Ukrainians would not give up their country, no matter will they freeze during the winter or not. We would do the same. So yes, we will pay more for gas, more for oil. Maybe we would not have it, but we will survive. Because if we have resilience and determination, we will do this. But the same applies also to authoritarian countries, because in authoritarian countries, nobody cares about people. So if the resilience level is small, then economically we will not be able to enforce them. So again, just like probably in medicine, there is no one medicine for the disease. You have to always have a cocktail, a mixture. And this is politics, military, and economics. Thank you for this moment.
Thank you for Dr. Pabriks, very insightful presentation or remarks that he briefly brought out the idea from the geopolitical, political and military sense, that talking about how we should, how we should refrain, or how we should do help ourselves. To respond to the international dynamics. And but I also want to highlight that Dr. Pabriks that mentioned a point that for the economic sanction that the Western countries has announced so far against Russia, there are ongoing discussions, or there are ongoing debates that how effectiveness of such kind of economic sanctions. In my earlier time, when I was also a trade scholar, we also make some estimates on this kind of economic sanction. We define that in such an economic integrated world, it is kind of hard, it is difficult, and it also costs for all the Western countries or for the like-minded democratic countries to make some economic sanctions against some countries that breaking international law. So we define from the records or from the data that Russia did a poor performance in trade at the starting point when the Western country put the economic sanctions in place. But actually, it did not last long. So, that is the lesson we should learn from the Russia case. because we don't know if there is any other country that breaking international law again, and that country is probably the second largest economic sense countries, then what will happen is that economic sanction will become even more difficult for all of us. So I think in this presentation, that just remind us we need to pay attention on this kind of issue. So thank you again. And let me welcome our second speaker, Director Paris. Yeah, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The main point that I want to develop in a few moments is that there's really two imperatives at the same time when you're talking about economic security. The first is the one that we talk about a lot in gatherings like this, which is the importance of reducing our individual and collective vulnerability to economic coercion and reducing the risk of relying on unreliable partners or supply chains as part of a larger way of strengthening ourselves and our close like-minded partners. The second part is the imperative of doing that without destroying the international trading system, which has generated so many benefits for so many countries and so many people for decades. So that's the point I want to develop. But first, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here again in Taiwan and in some small way to be expressing by my own presence my support for Taiwan and the challenges that you're facing. Just as it's a pleasure to be sitting beside my Latvian friend and to visit Riga from time to time, which is important. What matters in the Baltics and what matters on the eastern flank of Europe matters for not just the region, the continent, but the world. And my city where I live, Ottawa, is, I think, about 7,000 kilometers away from Riga, yet Canada has military forces in Latvia leading the NATO battle group as part of the deterrence effort. Why? Because it matters for Canada. And what happens in Taiwan also matters. And that's the kind of clarity, I think, that came through our lunchtime speaker and our previous speaker. Part of that clarity is also being honest with ourselves about the concepts that we're using. And here I come back to economic security, because we're living through a period of enormous transformation, not just in the geopolitical context, not just in the global economy, but in our concepts of economic management. As Minister Pabrik said, he described briefly the old orthodoxy. More openness would lead to more benefits and more peace and to the convergence of societies around a liberal democratic Francis Fukuyama end of history model. Maybe, even if we don't take it to the extent of the Francis Fukuyama thesis, this was a reflection of an orthodoxy that existed basically since from the end of the Second World War until quite recently. And so we are living through right now a moment when the old orthodoxy is going away, but we're not quite sure what the concepts are, the guiding concepts for the next period. As the Italian political theorist Antonio Gramsci once said, the old is dead, but the new is not yet born. And it's in moments like these that we have to be very honest with ourselves, honest about the threats that we face and the interconnectedness and the importance of standing with our partners, but also honest about the potential risks of the strategies that we're pursuing. So on one hand, as I said, economic security is about reducing our individual and collective vulnerability. And it's quite clear that that's something that is on the minds of many leaders in many different countries. We've heard the statistics from the president this morning about the level of trade with China and reducing dependency on China. There are many other countries that are thinking about de-risking their supply chains, and all of that is absolutely necessary right now. And part of that is strengthening partnerships among like-minded countries and partners. And so I'm very pleased to be here at a moment when finally Canada is taking action to strengthen its partnership with Taiwan, having 9 months ago concluded a FIPA with Taiwan, and I think just 4 months ago an agreement on technology and science and innovation cooperation, and I hope that that cooperation continues. But the risk is this. The risk is that the desire for economic security undoes so much of what has generated wealth over the past many decades that it creates economic insecurity. We don't have to think back to the extreme example of the 1920s and 30s and the beggar thy neighbor policies of competitive protectionism to realize that that kind of spiral of protectionism serves the interests neither of prosperity nor of peace. So the dilemma that we face collectively and as individual nations is to design policies that simultaneously increase our, reduce our vulnerability, increase our partnerships with like-minded partners, and to do so in a way that's measured. And I'm afraid to say, like so many other interesting problems, there is no magic solution here other than to continually be mindful of the fact that that's a balance that needs to be struck. Canada is trying in its own way to strike this balance. Unlike some other countries, there has not been a big popular backlash in Canada against free trade, which is a good thing, yet. There hasn't been a backlash yet. At the same time, the Canadian government has introduced very recently a number of measures that are meant to address some of these vulnerabilities, including new rules governing foreign direct investment in sensitive sectors and foreign direct investment by state-owned enterprises of certain countries, and new rules governing research in sensitive areas and the like. And one of the areas of particular interest to Canada is critical minerals, of which there is a lot in the ground in Canada. And part of that critical mineral strategy is intended both to get more of those minerals out of the ground in order to be able to feed them into supply chains that run through countries that are reliable partners. And part of it is also meant to be able to support and fuel an industry of batteries and electric vehicles and electric vehicle parts, which contributes not just to economic security, but also to our global goals of addressing climate change. And these kinds of strategies actually create great and interesting opportunities for cooperation. So recently, a Taiwanese company made a very major investment in the Canadian province of British Columbia in a battery plant, which will, when it's completed, produce up to 135 million lithium-ion batteries a year. And it will do that with electricity, which is 100% from renewable sources, because nearly 100% of the electricity in British Columbia is from renewable sources, and that's true for many other Canadian provinces too. Be a great place to put a chip fab, I think. Just saying, I don't know why I said that out loud. So you have this interesting opportunity that comes out of an economic security strategy, which is aligned with an economic development strategy, which is aligned with a climate strategy, which is aligned with a geopolitical strategy of strengthening relationships with key partners. And the opposite is also true. One of the biggest offshore wind projects in Taiwan, the implementing partner is Northland Energy, which is a company based in Toronto. And I'm delighted to think that that's the kind of cooperation that Canada and Taiwan can build upon. As an aside, Northland Energy also runs wind farms in the Baltic Sea off the coast of Poland, another country that we have a particular geopolitical interest in supporting. Not that those business decisions were made for geopolitical reasons. So let me just conclude by returning to where I started, which is there are ways of achieving economic security that don't necessarily risk undermining what we've built. But we have to be vigilant with ourselves, with our, say, localization requirements. We have to be vigilant with ourselves to say, if there are new restrictions to be established, are they essential? Or are they accomplishing something else? And we have to be vigilant with our partners. Because let's be honest, for a country like Canada, we can't think about economic security without thinking about the policies of the United States. And we need the United States to be a leader in economic security, both in the sense of economic security as protection from risk, and in the sense of helping to uphold a system which has generated so many benefits and which was built in the aftermath of a destructive war, which itself had as one of its causes the economic immiseration of a period of rampant protectionism.
Thank you. I think Director Paris just gave a very overall, insight about the Canadian strategy or consideration for economic security, and we are also aware that Canadian government just announced that they want to consult. They would like to make a public consultation about Canadians' economic security issues. And they provide an overall, very broad ideas. So if any one of you have interest or you would like to know about what is actually, or what is the general idea about economic security from the Canadian political side, then you can check with that public consultation announcement. And I think, and I would also want to echo your remarks that we should continue, Taiwan government should continue the dialogue with Canada. Not only, we have done for the FIPA agreement, the investment protection investment agreement with Canada that we have completed still last year, but we need to continue our cooperation and dialogue. And I think probably the economic security issue, and of course you also mentioned the critical mineral issues, that all issues that we can pick up and as a topic for our topics for our dialogue. Then I will invite our third speaker, Dr. Yo.
Yes. Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizer for inviting me to this very illuminating the forum. And I spent about 30 years in the Korean government, actually working in the areas of trade and the investment and industrial policy. And so I'd like to offer my perspective as a previous practitioner on these economic security issues. And also I'd like to make kind of 3 points that I think would be important for policymakers to kind of struggle to cope with this new economic security. I think the world has changed. I think our moderator, kind of laid out all this upheaval that the world has gone through for the last several years, starting from pandemic and supply chain disruption, but also this geopolitical tension between the US and China, and also climate crisis, and then the war in Ukraine and Middle East, etc. So because of all these complete change in the global economic circumstances, I think now it'll be very difficult for us to go back to this previous kind of hyper globalization era. In fact, I think countries like Taiwan or Korea have been one of the biggest beneficiaries of this free trade, global trade, multilateral trading system. But now this paradigm has completely changed. And I think this is a reality that this new security consideration, I think that has some limitation, some legitimacy, because this geopolitical tension and then also this techno-nationalism related to sensitive technology related, involving semiconductor, battery, EV, and then critical mineral, etc. I think there is some legitimacy, but also we have to be really keep in mind that we cannot overshoot. I think it's extremely difficult to find the right balance between this legitimate national security rationale, but also in a way not to hurt this commercial viability. So that's what I think many of these policymakers on the ground are struggling day to day. And in fact, I spent like almost 2 decades negotiating a lot of free trade agreement, the Korea-US FTA, Korea-EU FTA, and RCEP, and CPTPP, etc. But I think, for the last several years, I found myself, I spend more and more time on these economic security issues. The export control, when the Russia invaded, Korea joined, the US-led sweeping export control measures against Russia, which was first of its kind to Korea as well, and also investment screening, etc. So I think this is the new policy reality that we are facing, many policymakers are facing. And also, if I zoom in on this Indo-Pacific region, I think no region is more affected by this economic security than, by these economic security issues than this Indo-Pacific region. Because in many countries in the region, the US is a security guarantor or security partner. But because of this, the fast economic growth of China for the last couple of decades, to most of countries in the region, China is their #1 trading partner. So I think many of these countries in the region, they want to find new equilibrium between these two superpowers. So I think that's another big kind of dilemma that many countries are facing in the region. And also I think that the reconfiguration or realignment of this supply chain in the region is already happening. many of these global companies are kind of relocating from China to third nation, ASEAN, Vietnam, Indonesia, and and also India. So actually, despite all this uncertainty and sort of gloomy global economic picture, I think there are countries which are benefiting from this geopolitical tension. I think these are the countries which were not really given opportunities before, because previously everything just went to China. I mean, China was a factory of the world, and no other countries had opportunity like this. But now, because of this kind of a changing geopolitical landscape in the region, I think these countries and these economies offered new opportunities to develop their own industry. So I think that is kind of a mixed picture, but it's a positive development in an overall kind of uncertain global economic environment. And then I think now I'm in Washington, D.C., and kind of closely monitor what is happening in the U.S., the trade policy, and also this economic, security policy. And now I think, all these eyes from the world are on Chicago. This, National Democratic Convention is happening in Chicago. But I think no matter who wins the White House early next year, I think this overall trajectory of U.S. trade policy will be different from what we had expected and what he had hoped before, which is, I think, this domestic focus of U.S. trade policy, putting this domestic the manufacturing, and then also job creation, and sort of putting America first. I think those overall policy trajectory will continue regardless of who will occupy the White House next year. So I think the rest of the world needs to plan based on this kind of premise of this overall global economic environment for the next several years. And so based on this kind of overall picture that I laid out, I think there are three points that I want to emphasize. So how do policymakers cope with this new reality of economic security? I think number one, diversification. I think diversification is the most important because I think interdependence is inevitable and important despite all the protectionism spreading around the world. I mean, no countries can own the whole the supply chain in their own country. And especially countries, small or medium-sized countries like Taiwan or Korea, still trade and cross-border investment will continue to be important and continue to play a critical role in developing their domestic industry, economy. So I think we need to continue to diversify and kind of hedge risk coming from over-dependence or one or two or small group of countries. So in that sense, I think Korea or Taiwan previously heavily depend on China, but now I think it's kind of changing. The supply chain and trade landscape are changing towards more diversification. Especially in that sense, I think ASEAN and India become much more critical because these economies are very young and then very populous and emerging middle class economy. And and as I said, because of the changing nature of supply chain, these economies are given new opportunities to develop their own industry. So I think we really need to make use of these kind of new opportunities. And just for example, in Korea's case, Korea's investment in ASEAN began to surpass Korea's investment in China from 2014. So already this kind of diversification was happening, not because of this geopolitical tension, not because of government policy, but these big companies began to realize this changing, this calculation. And I think second point that I want to make is energy security. I think this during lunchtime, the former Prime Minister of Slovakia made a very insightful observation, the lessons from Europe. And I think it really applies to all these countries. And here, I think this energy security combined with this climate crisis provide new importance to this renewable energy or clean energy sources. Because like Europe, I mean Korea or many Japan or many countries in the region have heavily depend on this fossil fuel import from Middle East or in other countries with sort of geopolitical vulnerability. But the renewable energy, you don't need this political, geopolitical kind of risk when you develop this renewable energy. So this renewable energy, clean energy, is also very, kind of independent from this geopolitical vulnerability. And in addition to that, this Taiwan, Korea, or Japan, this semiconductor industry or AI and electronics, those are the kind of really, the center of this industry in this country. And right now, so-called this RE100, I mean, this industry, I mean, this private sector kind of driven new initiative in which all the global companies pledge to really source 100% from these clean energy sources by 2040 or 2050. I think these are really driving these changes from these market forces. And I understand that in Taiwan, about 33 companies, including TSMC and Acer, they committed themselves to this RE100, including Samsung, for example, and SK Hynix in Korea. But the problem is that in this country, there are not enough kind of the clean energy sources yet, because the climate is different from Europe. And I think one of the strengths of Europe, which can really develop these renewable energy sources, is that Europe is one energy market, meaning that all these the grid are interconnected. So sometimes the wind stop blowing, and sometimes the sun kind of disappear. But in Asia, each country is like energy island on its own. But in Europe, all these countries are interconnected with this grid. So although this wind stop blowing, they can import this electricity from neighboring country. So I think how to, the Asian countries can collaborate to really get over this deficiency, the lacking compared to European country. I think that is one of the key the policy the challenges. And lastly, I think this international cooperation is extremely important. I think during this conference today, all these global challenges that all these countries are facing, for example, climate crisis, supply chain, this disruption, etc. They were really brought up a lot. But how we can develop sort of a new platform or new framework for international cooperation to deal with this new type of challenges that we are facing. I think that is something that we really need to develop further. For example, I think it's a great achievement that Taiwan and the United States, they developed and they concluded last year this 21st century, this kind of new agreement covering this custom trade facilitation and kind of a standard, etc. But I think, and also now I think the second phase, the agreement, the negotiations are on the way. But I think one of the important area to consider is this supply chain and clean energy. These are the kind of new areas that the traditional free trade agreement, such as RCEP or CPTPP, or all these bilateral free trade agreement, couldn't really deal with. So I think recently the U.S. kind of led this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework with these new chapters on the clean energy and the supply chain resilience. So I think it's not perfect, but I think it's a kind of a important starting point. So how to develop this new framework for international cooperation in this new area, I think that's another important task. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
I think I quite agree with I quite agree with Dr. Mr. Yu that he mentioned that in his early days he actually worked a lot on the free trade agreement. In my earlier day, I mean when I was also a trade scholar, I would say liberalization was the golden rule in trade area. But nowadays they don't mention, they consider liberalization is kind of old-fashioned thing. That we only talk about, because they consider liberalization or the free trade agreement only, we only help those non-market autocracy to get economic development, and they take advantage of this kind of free trade agreement. So nowadays we pay more attention for the economic security and considering all the issues about enhanced investment screening, export control, and those kind of, and get a like-minded alliance. So we sometimes call, in old days, we would say globalization is the goal of our world. But now, probably is a time of deglobalization or slowbalization is coming, and probably that is a fact or the reality we need to face from now on. So then next, I'd like to invite Dr. Jason. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Good afternoon, and thanks for putting me on this panel. I think after the two previous speakers, I think there's very little to add. The two very, very good presentations on the trade front, covering quite some depth. I'm here basically to learn. I'm a former EU official, and I thought last year that what we are doing with Taiwan is not very consistent, and I was curious to see if we could learn something from how the Taiwanese industry is reacting, if we in Europe could learn from that process and adjust our own response to the new trading realities in a different way than we have done so forth. The inconsistencies that I see, I'll give you a couple of examples. One from Korea, from Mr. Yo's successor, one of your successors, where he was interviewed in April about the different restrictions and issues between China, or on China, I should say. And the response from him was that this is very good for South Korea because now we can take over a number of the businesses that used to be done in Taiwan. Another example I would give you is from the US, from the Secretary of Commerce, Raimondo, who consistently says that the US should be producing about 20% of the world's advanced semiconductors. And when I'm here in Taipei, it's a very different message that I get. One is that the dispute with China and the US is good for the Taiwanese economy. And the other message is that the most advanced semiconductors will continue to be produced here. So the point is that these things, they're very different impressions, and it's very difficult to tell what in fact is going on at this point of time because it's a moving target. One issue with trade negotiations, since Mr. Yo, he mentioned that, and the China and WTO accession. I was in the room at that time on the EU side, and I think none of us had the idea or the illusion that China would change its political system because they would become a part of WTO. I think another element which for me was quite important, and for us in the EU at that time was important, that was that China's accession to the WTO made it possible to get Taiwan in. And I think we should not forget that. And the last 20, 23 years of Taiwanese membership of the WTO has actually created quite a different economy here than it would have been without membership, in my view. Anyway, the China-US tensions are becoming the defining feature for this decade. It's striking to see how the relationship and the focus has changed so profoundly without the changes being sparked by a single critical event between the two parties. There's been no Sputnik event, the moment there's been no war between the two, but nonetheless, the relationship has gone through a dramatic change. The theme that we have here this afternoon is one of economic security. And there, I'd like to get you to think about economic security in two different dimensions. One is that with economic security, we are trying to secure our companies, our countries economically. That means that if imports shoot up, we have safeguard measures we can take. If other countries close markets or have closed markets, then we can go through with market opening measures. If the reliance on, say, energy from one partner, as we heard about in the speech over lunch, is that it's been seen as excessive, then and risky, then diversification measures can be taken. If we're being coerced economically, then we can take countermeasures against that. Same if intellectual property rights are being misused, we can take measures. So all these things are what we traditionally do in trade policy. And at the EU level, the colleagues in Brussels are very, very familiar with that. They have been doing that for many, many years. The other dimension of economic security is a new one. And that is one that we in Europe is less familiar with. And that's focusing on national security. And some of the presentations earlier today have been focusing exactly on that aspect. And that is, how do developments affect our existential national interest? For example, issues like the EU arms embargo against China is one of those measures. We have the EU's dual-use goods regulation, which bridges the two aspects, sort of the narrow economic company interest and the broader national interest. This is relatively new for the European Union, and with 27 member states, it's also a process which is quite difficult because the structure is not set up for that. And if you look at the sort of way EU has done internally, it has basically been trying to sort of create peace and stability within the EU by integrating economic interest. And that's also why we have the EU has been a very, very strong supporter, probably today still the strongest, of the international rules-based system, also of the International Criminal Court, the systems like the MPIA. All these different international agreements are something where the EU by nature is very supportive. In order to understand the current US-China tensions, it's useful to look at the underlying drivers, in my view. Concerning the first dimension, economic security, the basic position of the EU and the US are not that different. We are both trying to protect and promote our economic interest. Difference can appear with respect to concrete measures, often depending on how much of the cost of any measure or the benefit is borne by EU companies or by US companies. One European company that has been in forefront of all these dimensions in the discussions is, of course, the Dutch company ASML, which is very familiar here in Taiwan. And the views and the understanding of their newly retired CEO are therefore of special interest. And I think we should pay attention to what he said when he stepped down in an interview in July, where Peter Wennick, he said very clearly, he said the US-China disputes over chips are a question of ideology, and they're not based on facts, and they're set to continue. In other words, the disputes fall clearly into the second category. Fundamental national interests are at stake. These disputes about the ideology. But here we have to be careful because ideology doesn't mean necessarily democracy and non-democratic partners. It is more a question of the worldview. Why do I say that? I say that because, as Mr. Yo, he mentioned many of the changes we have seen in the economic structures with China has meant that the investments are moving from China to Vietnam. But Vietnam is the same political system as Beijing. There's no difference. So it's a different motivation than simply one of democracy and the promotion of democratic values. So what we have here is that the measures that are affecting basic national interest, there it matters less if there's a short-term economic gain for the partner that imposes it. What matters more is how does this affect the adversary compared to oneself? And that means that in the worst case, we can even have measures where the overall economic benefit is negative, but as long as the negativity is stronger for the adversary than for oneself, it's fine. Go ahead with them. And that, of course, when we look at issues as climate change, can be very, very worrisome when that kind of thinking is dominating the discussion. There's been a lot of talk about sanctions and economic coercion during the earlier sessions. I looked a little bit back. The first example I could find of economic sanctions dates back to 432 before Christ with the Megarian decree in Greece, of course. And they're still now, 2,500 years later, we're discussing, did this actually work or not? We don't know. If we stay in the region here, if we look at the sanctions from the US against Japan in the run-up to the Second World War, did they work? They certainly did not prevent war. War maybe would have come anyway, we don't know. But it's not sort of clear-cut that these sanctions were particularly successful. I'm from Denmark, and there we have the example of the Napoleonic Wars, where Napoleon, he had a trade blockade against the UK. And at some point, the UK, they thought that they should use a Danish fleet because we were neutral in Denmark. So they basically went in and tried to take over the fleet. They were successful in that. So they got, I think it was 7 ships. And in the process, they frustrated Denmark to that extent that Denmark became an ally of Napoleon. So, in other words, these sanctions, when we look back in history, the judgment of their success has been very, very questionable. When we look at the Chinese attempts to sanction us in Europe or other countries, I think in this room, I think we have probably more or less agreed that the efforts or the attempts from China have not been very successful. The first one I saw was in 1997, where Denmark sponsored a human rights resolution in Geneva. And the Chinese basically went in and they tried to block Chinese exports to China. And they succeeded in doing that. It lasted for about 2 years. But at that time, China was probably, I would say, maybe the 8th biggest trading partner of Denmark. So a small setback in terms of exports to China didn't really affect the Danish economy in any way. I would probably also, and I hesitate because we have Lithuanians in the room, But I'd say, I mean, if you look at Lithuania, middle of the Baltic, 40% of their exports, I think, are going to Poland, another 40% to Germany. The exposure to Chinese sanctions is very, very little. I know one can sort of try to enlarge the envelope and say, yes, but it's secondary sanctions and so on. Yes, but still, the control that China has over the European economy, in my view, is relatively limited. We have now created an anti-coercion instrument, which is a good thing in Europe. But I thought, when I first read about the anti-coercion instrument, it's interesting to see that you would probably never find such a regulation in the US. You would probably never find it in China, because those two countries would, by definition, say we cannot be coerced. Whereas in the EU, we take this sort of a role where the people are able to coerce us. One aspect could also be, of course, that it's being used by the EU vis-a-vis member states to make them comfortable with this instrument. We have had, during my trade history with China, we have had many sort of small examples, as the one with Lithuania, with China, where they tried to coerce us to do different things in a different way than we did before. I would say those attempts have generally been unsuccessful if the coercion takes place in a different area than the initial irritant. Say, in the case of Lithuania, the irritant was political. It was a question of the name of the Taiwan office in Lithuania. And the sanctions were on the trade side. That doesn't work very well. The same with the Danish example, where you have a human rights discussion and sanctions on the trade side. That doesn't work. Where the coercion can work is if the sanctions are in the same area, i.e. if an anti-dumping case is being raised by one partner and the other partner raises a parallel anti-dumping case to coerce a faster reaction in the response. Where will all this end? As an economist, I would say very unclear, because the cost that we are looking at here, I think we are underestimating them. To change supply chains in an environment as we have today, at the same time as in Europe, as we heard, we are building up our national defenses, which is going to be very costly for us. It's something that has to be done. So for me, sometimes it's a question of how many extra burdens can we take on and still be successful on this. And there, I would say, in a country like Denmark, you're pretty much at the limit of what people are prepared to accept. So I would probably tend to be a little bit less ambitious in some of these discussions than I would like to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jason. Because of the time limits, so I'd like to move to our last but not least, Dr. Wu. Please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. I'm very pleased that Dr. Paris quoted Antonio Gramsci, probably the greatest Western Marxist in the world, saying that the old is dead, but the new is yet to be born. I appreciate very much because, in Taiwan, in our young age, Antonio Gramsci used to be a must read for the critical Western Marxism. Okay, now I'm gonna go back to focus on my speech. I'm going to read it out. At a time of heightened Czech nationalism, the semiconductor supply chain is the lifeline of the competition between the United States and China. It's not just a technological race, but it's a battle for strategic dominance. At the forefront of this competition is Taiwan, which plays a crucial role in producing the world's most advanced chips. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, of course, is the key, with its chips powering smartphones to AI servers and military systems. But here's a pressing question. Does Taiwan's leading position in this semiconductor industry, often referred to as the Silicon Shield, actually protect it, actually protect Taiwan, or on the contrary, it increase the risk Taiwan faces? This debate is complex, involving various strategic views and interests, and it carries significant implications for global security. And it really depends on different perspectives. The Silicon Shield suggests that Taiwan's role in the global semiconductor supply chain acts as a deterrent against Chinese aggression. The other side of the coin, of course, is the deep interdependence of all parties within the supply chain, as many our speakers mentioned this idea just now. And my idea is quite simple. If Taiwan's chip production were disrupted, the global economy would face catastrophic consequences. Such a disruption would force international powers, especially the United States, to intervene to protect this vital line. But while the Silicon Shield might seem like a protective barrier, it's also a double-edged sword. The chip manufacturing prowess make Taiwan more even dangerous because China may covet it, and the US may press Taiwan even harder for diversification. So critics also argue that if China does not fear or respect the shield, it may prove ineffective. However, the issue is not just whether China respects the shield or not. It's about the global fallout from any possible disruption in the supply chain. The Silicon Shield isn't just about Taiwan itself, not just about Taiwan's security itself, but it's about global economic stability and security. And further, other critics contend that semiconductors may not be the issue for China at all, because China's broader ambitions include political and military control of this island country. While this argument has merit, I think it misses the broader picture. The true power of the Silicon Shield isn't just in Taiwan's semiconductor capabilities. It lies in the global consequences of any disruption to the chip supply chain resulting from a conflict over Taiwan or the region. Consequently, another critical factor is asymmetric damage. While China has advanced its own semiconductor industry with some salient progress, disrupting the global supply chain would likely inflict greater damage on the US and its allies than on China itself. This potential for asymmetric damage must be fully considered in strategic calculations. A military conflict would trigger a global disaster. That is why the Silicon Shield thinking is still crucial for us. To address the vulnerability in Taiwan's place in the supply chain, the US has adopted reshoring and friendshoring policies. These strategies aim to rebuild US chip-making capacity, reducing the risk of over-reliance on a single location, that is East Asia. However, these strategies are far from quick fixes. Reshoring semiconductor manufacturing is complex, costly, and time-consuming. It's challenging and expensive, very, very expensive to replicate Taiwan's semiconductor ecosystem elsewhere. This industry benefits from decades, I have to emphasize that again, benefits from decades of investment in infrastructure, research, and a specialized workforce. Advantages not easily replicated. Until these new fabs in the West are running for the world, will continue. The world will continue to rely heavily on Taiwan for semiconductor. Given these uncertainties, the immediate priority, of course, is to secure the Taiwan Strait. The region is a potential flashpoint in the US-China rivalry. Any conflict here would cause catastrophic consequences, fostering Taiwan from China's, protecting Taiwan from China's threats, no matter it's in the form of economic coercion, gray zone warfare, or military action, requires a comprehensive, multi-dimensional approach. Ensuring regional, ensuring regional peace is necessary, but not sufficient. Taiwan must also take a more active role in international cooperation. To address these complex challenges posed by Taiwan's position, I propose the concept of Silicon 2.0. This initiative seeks to elevate Taiwan's role in global economic security by more fully integrating it, I mean the Taiwan's semiconductor ecosystem, to integrate it more into the international production networks, both in terms of supply chain and geography. Locally, in here, there's often a misunderstanding about the original purpose of diversification of the chip-making facilities. Some fear it could lead to the dismantling of the Taiwan's protective holy mountain, Huguo-Senshan, or hollowing out the industry. Unfortunately, even some American experts misunderstand this too. They view the concept of Silicon Shield as a Taiwan-centric perspective, but I don't think so. Under Silicon 2.0, diversification isn't seen as a threat to Taiwan's economy and security. Instead, TSMC's investment in the global north, such as Arizona, Kumamoto, and Dresden, should be viewed as an extension of Taiwan's influence. These investments align with the strategic interests of the US and its allies. By doing so, Taiwan fosters deeper interdependence with the West, which enhances the resilience of the supply chain. So far, the US has focused on onshoring as a kind of insurance policy and securing the Taiwan Strait. However, there is another path, a third path, that is equally crucial, enhancing Taiwan's participation in international security mechanisms. Silicon Shield 2.0 aligns with this strategy, allowing Taiwan to play a more active role in global security. The deeper the codependence between Taiwan and the global democratic community, the more urgent the need for collaboration on economic security. Taiwan's current network of international support is largely bilateral and informal, which is insufficient to address the growing complexities of geopolitical shift. Expanding Taiwan's involvement in multilateral mechanisms would benefit not only the US, but its allies. These mechanisms will also give Taiwanese companies a voice on the world stage, enabling Taiwan to participate in a fairer game. This symbiotic relationship between Taiwan and the US in the semiconductor sector is very well documented. The US and its allies should reassure Taiwan of its commitment to broader international participation as Taiwan makes new investment in the global north. If the US presses harder on Taiwan without offering more secure guarantees and opportunities for international participation, skepticism about US intentions could arise. Okay, let me conclude. The takeaway message is simple. The Silicon Shield is not just a Taiwan-centric issue, it's a global one. To forge a secure and resilient semiconductor ecosystem, we need a comprehensive strategy This initiative offers a roadmap for elevating Taiwan's role in economic security. Taiwan's success is a linchpin of global stability, proving that in the interconnected world of semiconductors, security for one is security for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Because of the time strain, so I cannot open this session to Q&A. But I hope you have enjoyed the seminar this session as much as I have. And I would like to wrap up with some points that I think the most important key is that the risking approach probably or is likely to be a good idea to, a good solution in responding to not to be the target of coercion. And I think Taiwan is, for me, for my understanding, Taiwan is a leader in economic de-risking from China. So actually, I think Taiwan will welcome for all our trading partners to have more engagement with us and talking about those economic security issues. Before closing this session, please join me to thank you for our 5 distinguished speakers.
Thank you. Many thanks to our panelists. Thank you. And also thanks to Dr. Yen for moderating this session.